Chairman of the Department of City Planning, and I'm simply going to introduce Max Pfeffer, Chairman of the Department of Developmental Sociology. But just before I do, who will introduce our guest today, I want to say two things. One, being in a great university not too far from New York City allows us to really have wonderful speakers as guests. So I'm grateful for that. Second, this is the 8th in a series of lectures that began just 2 years ago. Jointly sponsored by Development Sociology and City Regional Planning, and it's the culmination of many, many years of work together by faculty and graduate students, and I'm delighted that it's going on so well. Without further ado, because we need the time, David, I'll shut up. Max?
I second that. How happy we all are to have you all here today, and also to have this lecture series in place. I want to remind you about the third lecture in this topical series on space, place, and time. And that lecture is going to be by Akhil Gupta, Professor of Anthropology at UCLA, who's going to speak on national poverty, global poverty, and neoliberalism. And that lecture, if you want to take a note, is going to be on April 18th at 3 p.m., and it'll be in this same lecture. Also, on behalf of Bill and myself, I want to thank Professors Maki and Benaria for organizing this series. We appreciate it very much. Well, perhaps I should say that David Harvey needs no introduction. His work, as we know, is far-reaching and influential, and is known to most, if not all of us. Professor Harvey is Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York. I was interested to see that he was recently honored by being elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Prior to joining the City University of New York faculty, he served as Professor of Geography at Johns Hopkins and Oxford Universities. Over the years, he's produced numerous influential books, some of which you'll see here on the side, talking about the trajectories of capitalism and their consequences, with a special emphasis on the spatial expression. His book, Spaces of Global Capitalism, extends his work on uneven geographical development, and it's the topic of today's lecture. I give you David Harvey.
What I decided to do today was to approach the question of uneven geographical development from the standpoint of urbanization, and to approach it also from a political standpoint around the theme of the right to the city. Who has the right to the city, and how is that right defined? And one of the reasons I decided to take this tack is there's a tremendous interest right now politically in the idea of human rights. It's one of the universals that we find ourselves coming back to very frequently. But for the most part, that notion of human rights gets defined in a universalistic way, and it's about the rights of the individual, which turn out to be inseparable, if you go back to the UN Declaration, from the rights of private property. And the problem with all of the politics that flows out of human rights is that there is almost no way that coming out of that you can challenge the fundamentals of liberal and neoliberal theory. And this for me is a problem, because I think that we have to find a way of challenging that theory. But there is one aspect of rights talk which I think is interesting, and that is the notion of collective rights, the collective rights of labor, the collective rights that were articulated through struggles over civil rights in this country in the 1960s that had global resonance, the struggles over women's rights, gay rights, and so on. So the notion of collective rights seems to me to have some kind of purchase. And so I thought it useful to start to dream about some sort of notion of a collective right to define the city. And this has another kind of appropriateness right now, because it's 40 years since 1968, and there's some sort of rethinking about what happened in 1968, what that was about, and this was, of course, a period when Henri Lefebvre first wrote some of his essays about the right to the city. And it's interesting that a big part of the 68 movement was about the city. This is often forgotten in the general kind of accounting, the general mythology of it, and I think that reclaiming the point that the 68 movement was about the city as much as it was about anything else is useful and important. And it so happens that there's a group of us, academics, intellectuals in New York City, who for the last 2 years have been regularly meeting on the theme of the right to the city. And we were surprised to find through some of my students, it turns out that there is a national movement in the United States called the Right to the City movement that has been in existence now for just over a year. And it's a coalition of groups fighting gentrification, defending rights in public housing and all the rest of it around the nation, which is attempting to form together and form alliances with people who are interested in environmental justice questions and people who are interested in education and all the rest of it. So there's a sense in which the social movement's moving towards some kind of idea of the rights to the city as something that needs to be re-established, and something which I think, if you look at the dot map of foreclosures in any major city around the world, in the United States right now, you would immediately see that there is an incredible impact on low-income communities, particularly African-American communities and the like. So you look at Cleveland or Baltimore or Detroit or wherever, you'll see the differential impact of this. And in a sense, you can see the defense of populations of that sort from the predatory lending practices that have gone on is going to be, I think, a very big issue. It so happened that this national group had a national meeting in New York in January, and having found out about it, I invited some of them to stay over and talk to us, academics, intellectual groups, and we now think about some kind of collaboration around the issue of the right to the city as being an umbrella claim through which we can start to articulate a different kind of politics. Now, what does the right to the city really mean? On this point, I always go back to my favorite quote from Robert Park, when he kind of said, well, you know, the city is our supreme attempt to reshape the world more after our heart's desire. But in so reshaping the world, we've reshaped an environment in which we're henceforth condemned to live. Therefore, in reshaping that world, we have, in a way, reshaped ourselves. Now, what this means to me is that the right to the city is not about a right of access to what the city is about and what resources of the city are about. The right to the city is the right to reshape it more after our collective heart's desire. That is, to remake the city in a different image. Because in remaking the city, we remake ourselves. Therefore, the question of what kind of city do we want cannot be divorced from the questions: what kind of people do we want to be? What kind of relation to nature do we value? What kinds of technologies do we find appropriate? What kinds of aesthetics are we concerned about? What kind of sociality, daily life do we care about? So that all of those questions are really about us as much as they are about the city. And it is that dialectic between city formation and human personality transformation which I think is crucial to reflect upon.